So our Torah portion today is called Balak. It begins in Numbers chapter 22, verse 2. So I'm going to read those verses over to verse 6. Now Balak, the son of Zippor, saw all that Israel had done to the Amorites. And Moab was exceedingly afraid of the people. Note that. Exceedingly afraid of the people because they were many. And Moab was sick with dread because of the children of Israel. Note that. So Moab said to the elders of Midian, now this company will lick up everything around us as an ox licks up the grass of the field. And Balak, the son of Zippor, was king of the Moabites at that time. And then he sent messengers to Balaam, the son of Beor at Pethor, which is near the river in the land of the sons of his people, to call him, saying, look, a people has come from Egypt, and see, they cover the face of the earth and are settling next to me. Therefore, please come at once. Curse this people for me, for they are too mighty for me. Please note that. Perhaps I shall be able to defeat them and drive them out of the land, for I know that he whom you bless is blessed, and he whom you curse is cursed. So there are, in this particular Torah portion, like some others, there are so many things that we could talk about. I mean, we could be here hours and hours just talking about the principles and the precepts that we see in this particular Torah portion. But one of the main points that we're going to hit on is this: how those with wicked hearts react to God's people. We just read it. There are those like Balak, this man that we talk about here, or I've just read about here. There are people who hate God's people, who want them cursed, who want them destroyed, who want them eliminated. They want them cursed so that their numbers would be reduced and that in time they would just wither and die. But that is the ultimate objective. That is why Pharaoh did the things that he did. He wanted to bring the Hebrews under his rule and under his tyranny, and not destroy them all at one time, mind you, but put these oppressive policies in place that were to diminish them, to make them dependent upon Pharaoh, to keep the baby in the womb and then abort the baby while it was in the womb. That's basically what that was all about. And this is kind of the same thinking, same objectives. And notice that it says that Balak was sick with dread at the sight of Israel because he believed that they were going to come and consume him. But I want you to take notice that Israel hadn't done anything to him. They were just pitching their tents, living life, doing what they were supposed to do, and that very thing bugged him to death. He couldn't stand the fact that they were close to him, that they existed, that they were living, that they were thriving, and all these things. He couldn't handle that. But they had not done anything to him. And so we conclude that it was simply their presence that bothered him. Simply that they existed, that bothered him. And they were close to him, and that bothered him. So this is what prompted him to send for Balaam. He saw Israel as being more and mightier than he. And I've shared this idea with you before, that every time the enemy looks upon God's people and concludes that God's people are more and mightier than he, they get scared. And when they get scared, they start plotting. They start scheming. So the Bible is over and again revealing to us that those who dread Israel long for a dead Israel. Now, I'm not just talking about the land over there in the Middle East. I'm talking about when the enemy dreads God's people. The enemy wants God's people dead. Now, thankfully, we have a God that watches over us, preserves us, sustains us, defends us, protects us, right? Because don't you know, if the adversary could have, he would have destroyed Adam and Eve right then and there, right? If he could have done that. But he can't. He can't do any more than what the Father allows him to do. So then, but I want you to really embrace this idea. When God's people are doing what they're supposed to be doing, the enemy gets worried. And then the enemy starts trying to figure out how he can destroy, how he can curse. So then the Bible reveals then that all these examples of the people who dread Israel, who want them dead. Then what do? They go out and look for accomplices. They look for people who will help them, who can assist them in this effort. Here's an example. In the last days, there is going to be a confederation of nations that are aligned against Israel. Psalm 83, verse 1. Do not keep silent, O God. Do not hold your peace. And do not be still, O God. For behold, your enemies make a tumult, and those who hate you have lifted up their head. They have taken crafty counsel against your people and consulted together against your sheltered ones. They have said, come and let us cut them off from being a nation, that the name of Israel may be remembered no more. For they have consulted together with one consent. They form a confederacy against you. And then it goes on and lists all the different nations that comprise this confederacy. The tents of Edom, the Ishmaelites, Moab, the Hagrites, and many, many, many more. But I want you to notice something, that the name of Israel may be remembered no more. They don't even want that name mentioned. Why? It's not because the people of Israel have always been that great and wonderful. To the contrary, they were always in trouble, remain in trouble in terms of what their call is, right? But the point is, the reason the adversary doesn't want the name of Israel to be remembered no more is because in that name, embodied in that name, is God's purpose for a people in this world. A people who are set apart, who are regarded as a holy nation, a kingdom of priests, and who are, when standing on what is true, standing on what the rock really is. The Messiah says that when we are doing what we're supposed to be doing as his people, not even the gates of hell itself will be able to prevail against us. And that scares the adversary pretty badly, to the point that he starts going and working in all these nations, and getting all in the minds and hearts of these people, and getting them to see God's people as just their very existence is a threat. So again, their aversion for Israel is not because Israel, and again, when I say that, I'm talking about God's people. It's not because of our aggression against them. I dare say that most everybody in this room and everybody watching, there are certain lifestyles and philosophies in this world that are being shoved down our throats, that if it were not that, we wouldn't agree with them, but we wouldn't be going and chasing them down to beat them into submission. Is that right? Okay, we would disagree with them, but you know what? That's for you and God to work out later. I'm going to live my life. But it's not that way, is it? We can't just live the way that we've been called to live in peace without being assailed and accused and all these things. Am I the only one who sees it that way? I just want to make sure. And so again, it's their aversion for Israel is not because of our aggression against them, but it's just the fact that God's people and purpose exists in the world. That's what they cannot abide, because our purpose in this world is a threat to them and to their kingdom and to their Lord. As I've said many times before, the tares are never content to stay in their own field. I'm content for the tares to stay over there and leave me alone. Okay? But it doesn't work that way on the other side. The tares are never content to stay in their own field. They look over at the wheat field and they're thinking, how can I mess that up? How can I get in there and mess that up and disrupt what's going on? So they're not going to stay in their own field. They are aggressive by nature. They're never going to be content with this separation that God calls for us to embrace in terms of living like the world. They want to infiltrate the wheat field, and they want to choke out everything that God has planted. And so, because of this inclination on the part of the nations at large, And because of their fear of God and his purpose, and because of their dread of the people of God, they line up these accomplices and they get all these confederates to come together with them against God's people. In Balak's case, he was fearful of losing power and position. I'm going to say that again. The king of Moab was afraid that somebody was going to take his power away from him and take his position and lick up everything around him. And when people get to thinking that way, when position and power is so important to them, and they feel there is a threat to that, they will go to great extremes to hold on to their power and their position if they feel it's threatened. After Lazarus was raised from the dead, here's what the Bible tells us in John chapter 11. Many had seen the things Yeshua did, believed in him, but some of them went away to the Pharisees and told them the things Yeshua did. Then the chief priests and the Pharisees gathered a council and said, "What shall we do?" That amazes me right there. What shall we do? Not, he just raised a man from the dead. But what shall we do? For this man works many signs. And if we let him alone like this, which translates in my mind, if we don't pester him, if we don't accuse him, if we don't assail him, if we don't attack him, after he just raised a man from the dead, if we let him alone like this, everyone will believe in him, as if that's a bad thing. Are you tracking with me here? People start thinking this way when, and here it is, and the Romans will come and take away both our place and our nation. We need to save the nation. I let that one slip out, didn't I? That's what they said. They will come and take away both our place and nation. And one of them, Caiaphas, being high priest that year, said to them, "You know nothing at all, nor do you consider that it is expedient for us that one man should die for the people and not that the whole nation should perish." So they're terrified that they might lose power, they may lose their position among the people, and so they determined that Messiah was to die. But then look what they did. They went out and enlisted the assistance of people they otherwise despised, the Romans. So here's what Balak does. He goes and sends messengers to Balaam over in Mesopotamia, this seer who apparently has a reputation in that part of the world. And so Balak's the first villain in our story. Balaam is the second. I'm not going to go through all of the details. We've read this. You've read it, talking donkeys and, curses and blessings and all these things. I know you're familiar with the story. If not, read it. But I want to say this. Balaam represents those who, for the love of money, the love of honor, the love of power, are willing to design schemes that are intended to place a snare before God's people in the hopes of destroying them. That's what he ends up doing. So in that vein of thought, I want you to consider what Yeshua had to say to the congregation at Pergamos. And this is in chapter 2 of Revelation, verse 14. "I have a few things against you, because you have there those who hold the doctrine of Balaam, who taught Balak to put a stumbling block before the children of Israel, to eat things sacrificed to idols and to commit sexual immorality." Of course, he's referring to what occurs at the end of this Torah portion, the sin of the Baal Peor, when these men of Israel went, because they were seduced by these good-looking Midianite women, and they go to this sacrificial meal and eat this meal dedicated to the god of Peor, the Baal of Peor, and they entered into all other kinds of things associated with that. But who taught them to do that? Balaam. And so that's what we say. That's why I said he represents those who, because they love money, because they want prestige, because they want power, they're willing to devise schemes. And I don't think that Balaam got Balak out in front of everybody to talk about this. They probably went in to a private chamber and said, here's what we can do. Here's the plan. Here's the plot. We're going to lay a trap for them. We're going to lay a stumbling block for them. So Yeshua addresses this. I have this against you because you hold to this same kind of doctrine, and this doctrine of Balaam, teaching others to place a stumbling block before God's people. And in Pergamos, what that resulted in is partaking of abominable things, entering into sexual immorality. Two of the things, by the way, that new believers in Acts chapter 15 were told to abstain from. Stay away from all of that. When it comes to the doctrine of Balaam, as it's defined here, there are situations, it seems to me, when the greater sin is to cast a stumbling block before people. Let me try to explain what I'm talking about here. Just because you have the right to do something doesn't mean it's right to do. Just because you have the right to say something doesn't always mean it is right to say. Because there are some situations that your liberty and your right might cast a stumbling block before somebody else and cause them to stray, to go into error, or to just withdraw. You understand what I'm saying here? So that's maybe a general overview, but that is what he's talking about, casting a stumbling block before people, which is essentially setting a trap for them. Because they're weak, they're not mature enough to recognize it or to handle it properly, whatever the case may be. So causing others to stumble because of your choice is a very serious thing. That's why we need to be very, very, very careful about what we say and who we say it in front of, what we do and who we do it in front of. Because always somebody's watching, and your actions, my actions, our words, your words, they may have a negative impact on somebody else. So then, in this same passage in Revelation, he talks about the doctrine of Balaam, and he connects it to the Nicolaitans, or how do you pronounce it? The Nicolaitans, or Nicolaitans. Take your pick. These were the followers of Nicholas of Antioch, who had, according to what I read, forsaken sound doctrine. He was allegedly indifferent to what a man ate and how a man lived. In fact, I come across one quote talking about this doctrine and the people who held to his doctrine, that they were said to be, quote, shameless in their uncleanness. That's pretty bad. Point is, Yeshua links these people that are shameless in their uncleanness to the doctrine of Balaam. One commentary suggests that this word Nicolaitans has been derived from two Greek words. One, Nikon, which means to conquer, and Laos, which means the people. To conquer the people. Think about that. Balaam, by the way, is derived from two Hebrew words that infer the very same thing, to lord over the people. So very influential people who have designs on lording over or ruling over the people. But connect that to how they do it. They set a stumbling block. They set a snare. They prey on the weak and the immature and lure them into that trap. They have this great influence over the people. And in both cases, they devise doctrine that leads God's people into disobedience and rebellion, because their intention was and is to conquer God's people, to render them ineffective. I read something, I'm debating within myself whether to say this. I am. But I was reading something the other day that was commenting on events of last weekend. And how this one gentleman who had not been impressed with the former president all that much is very impressed with him now. But here's his reasoning. Because if people are willing to try to take you out, that must mean they see you as a threat. Okay? And he is asking this question: how many pastors and leaders in the body of Messiah are actually a threat to the kingdom of darkness?
That's right. That's right.
In other words, he reasons if they're taking a shot at this guy who is all these things that people talk about all the time, why isn't that happening? And he's not wishing this on anybody, nor am I inviting it. But he's just saying, if they're taking shots at this guy or that guy, how many pastors and leaders in the body of Messiah out there are, his words, worthy of being shot at? Now, do you understand what I'm trying to say here? In other words, how many leaders in the body of Messiah, how many congregations in the body of Messiah are actually a threat to the kingdom of darkness? And I don't know about you. I don't want to invite repercussions, but at the same time, I want to be part of a body that is actually a threat to the kingdom of darkness. Not because of us, not because of me or you or us, but because the presence of the Almighty is working in and through us, and that we're doing what we've been called to do, and that is to break through, break out, and advance against the kingdom of darkness and take territory away from the adversary, right? That's what we're supposed to do, is it not? So I hope you understand what I was trying to convey by bringing this gentleman's observation into it, all right? That is not any kind of political endorsement. It's just looking at what's going on around us and how does this speak to us? How does this speak to us? Because the adversary, and through those he works through and works in and through, their intention is to conquer God's people, to render us ineffective. The adversary is also very good about setting the snare that we, unfortunately, walk into, and then we end up bringing upon ourselves the things that the adversary does not have the authority to do. That's what the sin of Baal Peor teaches. That he's really good about setting a trap, and we just run into it. Particularly those who are immature and weak in the faith, they run into it, we run into it, and then we bring upon ourselves the things the adversary wouldn't otherwise be able to do. So here's why we need to heed this today, because I believe that what happened then is happening now in many, many, many ways. Here's something I've shown you before. In rabbinical commentary, it is noted that the names Balak and Balaam, and if we can, do you have that to put on the board? There's Balak, all right? Bet Lamed Kuf, and now Balaam. Do you have that to show? Bet Lamed Ayin Mem. So if we took the last two letters, here is Balak and Balaam, or Balaam. You take the last two letters of those two names, here's what you come up with. Amalek. I thought that was very interesting. Now, remember Amalek. Amalek is Esau's grandson. Amalek and his descendants are the ones that attacked Israel as they journeyed through the wilderness. Specifically, Amalek attacked those who were weak. He attacked those who were stragglers. He attacked those who were feeble. Let's put it this way. He attacked those who were close to the edge. He attacked those who were just kind of lagging behind and consequently were more vulnerable. I would recommend to you that Amalek's tactic would have been less successful if there had not been stragglers, if there had not been people just kind of lagging behind. Nevertheless, God was not happy about it, and he declared war on Amalek for all generations. But the point, once again, is look what Balak was motivated by. Look what he did. Look what Balaam was motivated by. Look what he did. And it kind of goes hand in glove with what Amalek did. Because there's this people that their very existence is a threat and they must be destroyed. But they're more and mightier than we, and so we're going to have to do it very, very skillfully, very strategically. So let's start with the weaker ones first, and we'll work around the edges, and then if we can get into the midst of them, then we can sow tares in the midst of the wheat, and you know how that ends up. Now, I want to add a footnote to this, and I think I've shared this with you before, way back, but it seems to be appropriate to share it now. There is a certain woman who used to be a senator in a state that I will not name, who is now in the executive branch of the government. Her name has been in the news quite a bit lately. But you take those letters in English that form Amalek and you rearrange them, you end up with that name. I'll leave that to you to figure out. And in my view, this person and many others in that camp bear the same kind of fruit that we see with Balaam, Balak, Amalek, all these others. And if that is so, then that tells me that we are living in the same kind of a scenario that Israel found itself in regard to the fact that there are people who seek our destruction simply because we exist. Around the world, there are those who are in dread of God's people. They want us quieted, they want us diminished, and eventually eliminated. Oh, they would never do anything like that. Go back and read your history. This is what the adversary does. This is his intent. So they want us to be quiet. They want us to go and just kind of, die out and be eliminated. Now, I know that most of the people that we're talking about wouldn't dare say the latter out loud. But I would recommend to you, it's becoming very obvious because all this is playing out right in front of us nationally, internationally. This is not a political message. That is not my intent. I don't want you to go there. It's just these are the things that are happening in our world all around us, and we can't afford to just, stick our head in the sand and go kumbaya. Because you see, we are here in this world to impact this world for the kingdom of heaven, right? That is what we need to be contending for, and contending for the kingdom of heaven means we need to be prepared to fight. To arm ourselves with the Word of God, to be empowered by the Spirit of God, to be courageous in Him, knowing that the Lord our God goes before us. He's our rear guard, and there is no one we should fear. There is nothing we should fear, right? So now, I'm going to read you something here that I'm trying to do this carefully because I don't want anyone to misrepresent what I'm trying to do here. But I haven't really kept up with the news in years. And now all of a sudden I feel like, you should probably keep up with the news. But I read something by a couple of guys that I felt like I wanted to share it with you. There's a gentleman, I won't call his name, I would regard him as being a secular news commentator. But with everything that's going on in the world today, he made this observation, and particularly in reference to recent events. He says, a lot of people were reminded this weekend that there is a spiritual battle underway. And what caught my eye was, this is a secular guy. Maybe he's more spiritual than I thought. He certainly doesn't come across that way. But that's what he said. There is a spiritual battle underway. He goes on, there are forces within every society because they reside in the human heart that are against people. They're dedicated to the destruction of people and the civilizations that people have built. And as an example, he said this, Christian nationalism is a phrase used by, and he uses a term that is referencing people who are on the far left of things politically. He says Christian nationalism is a phrase used by these people to make Christianity seem like a threat to the country. The group that makes them that is the far left, angry, that is, who makes the far left angry? We would say now is Christians. So-called Christian nationalists, the people who pray outside abortion clinics, the people who celebrate the resurrection of the Messiah, those are my words, not his, and these are his words, Trans Visibility Day. These are the real enemies in their mind. What group do they dislike most? What group, listen to this, are they absolutely terrified of and hoping to eliminate? Is Christians. That's from a secular guy.
Wow.
I'm thinking, if secular people are coming out and saying this, oh my goodness, where is the body? All right, anyway. So again, my reason to quote this, gentlemen, is to make this point. If these secular-minded people are recognizing this, shouldn't we? All right, and so that leads me to this conclusion. If they're going to target us anyway, let's make it worth their while. Let's do something. And you need to be reminded, we don't win battles with bullets and bombs, right? Our warfare is not carnal. We're not fighting flesh and blood. We're fighting principalities. We're fighting those spiritual forces that are working in the world through people, yes, but that's not who we're really fighting here. So I need to make that very, very clear. Okay. Nevertheless, if they're going to put a target on us, let's give them a good reason, because we're actually doing what our King has called us to do. And that is to go and advance against the kingdom of darkness, take territory away, and liberate those who are in bondage and spiritual captivity, all right? Here's another national personality. I will give you his name. He's the former governor of Arkansas, Mike Huckabee. He said this, quote, "I'll get mocked for saying this, but the battle we're in is not political. It's spiritual." I agree. There has always been, and until the Messiah comes and puts down his enemies, there will always be those who are threatened by the very existence of God's people, who are threatened by God's purpose in the earth. And our Father is not oblivious to this. It has not taken him by surprise. He knew this, he knows this, and yet he put you and me here in the kingdom for such a time as this. There are always going to be people motivated by carnal desire who seek our destruction. And this Torah portion teaches us this. It's not always the external foe. It can be, but not always. Sometimes it's those who are among us. So in that vein, it's important for us to remember who Balaam is associated with biblically. This is in the book of Jude, verse 11. "Woe to them, for they have gone in the way of Cain. They have run greedily in the error of Balaam for profit and perished in the rebellion of Korah. These are spots in your love feasts, while they feast with you without fear, serving only themselves. They are clouds without water, carried about by the winds, late autumn trees without fruit, twice dead, pulled up by the roots, raging waves of the sea, foaming up their own shame, wandering stars for whom is reserved the blackness of darkness forever." In other words, it seems to me that he doesn't have a good impression of these people. But I want you to notice these people are not necessarily on the outside of things, but are on the inside of things. These three villains, Balaam, Korah, and Cain, are not on the outside. At one point, they had all been, in some way, part of God's people. Cain was Adam's son, just as Abel was Adam's son, right? God spoke to Cain personally, directly, about doing the right thing. Cain rejected that. Korah was a Levite with these great responsibilities. He was related to Moses. He was part of the congregation. We know that story. Balaam, in chapter 22, verse 18, he actually refers to the Lord as my God. He says, the Lord my God. Kind of an interesting thing. I mean, Balaam has conversations with God. He says to people who've come to invite him to do this, he says, y'all wait out here. I need to go in the back and talk to God. And he goes back, talks to God, and God talks to him. And he comes back and he says, this is what the Lord said. That's pretty impressive, actually. But now we regard him as a false prophet. And not because he couldn't prophesy, because he did. But it's other things got in the way. He's not a false prophet because of his inability to hear God's voice, even regarding Israel. He heard God's voice in regard to future events. But knowing all this, he was motivated to destroy Israel anyway. Peter referred to his madness and his love for the wages of unrighteousness. So then, he, along with Cain, along with Korah, both of whom, by the way, those other two guys, Cain and Korah, what was their motivation, you think, to do what they did? I'm looking for one word: jealousy. Jealousy. I want what you have. I want what you have. They're motivated by jealousy. Anyway, all three of these are likened to those who left Egypt but did not believe, which brings it into our world. Cain, Korah, Balaam are likened to those who left Egypt, those who believed that if they put the blood of the lamb upon the doorposts and lintels of their home, that God would pass over them. Those people, but when they got out into the wilderness, they quit believing. They didn't believe God could finish the job. And he goes on to say that they defile the flesh, reject authority, and speak evil of dignitaries. Now, back to the Torah portion. When Balaam was ultimately given the permission to go and speak with Balak, he's going with these men. Personally, I'm like, I believe this is one of those situations where God says, okay, go ahead. Go ahead. Let's see what you're going to do. In other words, allowed for a scenario to either test what was in his heart or to reveal what was in his heart. And I believe God knew exactly what was in his heart. I believe that's why there was an angel standing in front of him with a sword drawn, because he knew what was in that man's heart. So it seems to me that he gave him an opportunity to do the right thing, to see what was in his heart. Or maybe it could be for everybody to see what was in his heart. But again, he set up these obstacles in his path. You know, the angel with the sword drawn. The donkey sees this and he turns away. You know, Balaam, who is a seer, did not see, right? He didn't see the trouble ahead, so he starts beating his donkey. I'll move on. And you know, the donkey runs into the wall and Balaam's foot is crushed. He couldn't turn to the right or to the left. And I don't know why I've never thought about this before, or at least I don't remember thinking about this before, but the fact that his foot was crushed kind of struck me as interesting. And here's the reason: because the foot has a heel. The symbolism that is associated with the heel, ekev in Hebrew, it plays a very important role in Israel's purpose, because it goes back to when Jacob was born. Remember, Esau is born first, but Jacob, the second born, he comes out and he's got his hand on his brother's heel. And I will always believe until the day I die, the reason his hand was on his brother's heel was to prevent his brother's heel, who is his nemesis, from crushing his head. And that is tied to what we see in Genesis chapter 3, when God speaks to the serpent and says that I'm going to put enmity between you and the woman and your seeds. You'll bruise his heel, but he is going to crush your head. I believe with my whole heart that that prophecy that was given to the serpent and to his seed From that time, he's been trying to reverse that. He's been trying to take his heel, metaphorically speaking, and put it on our head to crush us, and to destroy us. And so that the very existence of God's people is why he wants to crush the head. Right? The enemy continues to trample or attempt to trample upon God's people. But here's the good news. Like Israel, we are destined to overcome. What did he tell Jacob when he renamed him Israel? Because you have struggled with God and have prevailed, you're going to prevail over your enemies. You're going to prevail over men. And the implication there is that if you are walking the way you're supposed to walk, if you're doing what you're supposed to be doing, if you're on that path that leads to life, the one and only path, the straight and narrow path, then you are going to be authorized and empowered to take your heel and put it on the head of your adversary, because we are following in the heel prints of our master who went before us and overcame this world. He said, because I've done it, now I'm going to empower you to do it, right? So it was just kind of interesting to me that his foot is crushed. And again, every foot has a heel. The essence of this story is this. A man with power hates that Israel exists, sees them as a threat, and then he calls upon another to come help him curse and really destroy this people. And that is in spite of the fact that even according to Balaam's own account, Israel is to be alone, that is to be set apart. Israel has no motivation to show aggression against others in a physical sense. They just want to be left alone. But nonetheless, their adversaries can't deal with that. There's no reason really to curse them, and yet they're hated. And you know why? Because they're blessed. Jealousy. That jealousy thing again. My Father, don't you have a blessing for me also? He didn't feel that way about the responsibility that went with the birthright. Jealousy. Because God's people are blessed, the other people want them dead. You think about it, that's why Laban oppressed Jacob years before, because he was prospering because this guy Jacob was in his house, and even that bothered him. And he was trying to figure out how I could steal and get a little bit more from this guy who actually is the reason that my house is blessed. I mean, that's just stupid. Yeah. That's stupid. That's cutting your nose off to spite your face. All right? That's what he did. And that's why Balak wanted to curse them. Laban's treachery and Balaam's attempt to curse Jacob came to nothing. Because in the end, and this is a truth, and we need to always remember this, no one can curse what God has blessed. It's impossible. This is why I do not believe that if I am born again, if I am filled with his Spirit, that I can be possessed by something that is unclean. I don't believe that. I don't believe that. I do not fear when these Wiccans and witches and all these voodoo people start, all this kind of stuff. I'm not intimidated by that, because I know that the power of God, the one who lives in me, is stronger than that, okay? Now, but there are other people who would be subject to those things. And why? Because they're not walking under the umbrella of his protection, right? Did I just lose some of you with that? You just need to know where I stand on this. I don't go looking for a boogeyman behind every bush and rock. I mean, people who have done that, find them. But we need to be the kind of people when the boogeyman wants to show up here, that the presence of God is so strong that they cry out and are delivered from that. Because that's what Messiah did. He didn't play with them. He didn't mess around with them. He said, shut up, get out. And it was done. All right, I'm getting off track just a little bit. But I don't believe that any man can curse what God has blessed. Here's the scripture. Isaiah 54. No weapon. No weapon formed against you shall prosper. And every tongue which rises against you in judgment, you shall condemn. This is the heritage of the servants of the Lord, and their righteousness is from me, says the Lord. Which, two things there that jump out at me. I shouldn't fear. I shouldn't fear the threats and the accusations and the plots and the schemes if I am his. I shouldn't. I don't stick my head in the sand and pretend they're not there. I need to be wise, I need to be prudent, but I don't need to be in fear of them. Because if I get in fearful of them, I'll make decisions based on that fear, not what is written. Okay? The second thing that jumps out at me is, and I have the promise of that protection and security, not because I'm a great and wonderful guy. It's because the righteousness is from him. It's his righteousness. It comes from him. It's because of his goodness and his mercy and his compassion. Everybody in this room and everybody who's watching, you're familiar with this notion. When it comes to family, I can talk about them all I want to, but don't you dare say a word about them. Right? You can talk about how, this one and your family has this problem and they have this issue and blah, 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 blah. But don't be getting up there, but your family and blah, blah, you're going to, what was it Merle Haggard said? You're on the fighting side of me. Merle Haggard was a musician back in the 60s and 70s and 80s. And just for those who are a little too young to understand what I just said. But I mean, it's true. I can talk about my family. I can talk about the problems in my family. We're just like everybody else. But don't you dare start, saying something bad about somebody in my family, because you're going to see another side of Bill. And I would expect that the same would be true of you, right? I said that for this reason. It seems God feels the same way about his family. He never hesitates to rebuke people in his family harshly, sometimes abruptly. In fact, I would dare say that he gets on to us long before he gets on to them. I'm kind of that way with mine. I hold my children to a very, very high standard. I hold them to a higher standard than I hold others to. And sometimes they have thought, they thought that, that's not fair. Get over it. I have expectations of you because you're mine. You're my son. You're my daughter. Same's going to hold true for my grandchildren, on a little softer note. Anyway. But you understand what I'm saying here. God is the same way, it seems to me. He will not hesitate to rebuke his children when it's necessary. In fact, the end of this portion, what happens when they sin at Baal Peor? He allows a plague to break out amongst the camp. People are dying. So he will rebuke, he will chasten, he will correct his people, and he will do it very quickly and sometimes very, very harshly. But why did he do that? To teach them a lesson. You have to be on guard against these traps that the Balaams and the Balaks and all these people who would lay a stumbling block before you. You have to be wiser than that. You have to be alert to what is right and what is wrong, and don't fall into their trap. So he chastened them very severely. In other words, he is the one who deals with his family in the way that he chooses at his time. But don't you dare come against his people with a curse, and then particularly when it's without cause. Because this is what he had to say to Balaam to go and tell Balak about his children. Numbers 23, verse 21. He, that is the Creator, has not observed iniquity in Jacob, nor has he seen wickedness in Israel. The Lord his God is with him, and the shout of a king is among them. That's the way God chooses to see his people, to see his family, to see his children. Remember when Jacob is leaving Lavan and he's coming back into the land, you remember what Rachel had hidden away? Remember? Okay. So Lavan overtakes him and he's going through Jacob's tent. And he's looking all over the place for these idols and he can't find any. Now we know the story. She had hid them very, very shrewdly. My point is, God knew they were there, but he was not going to let Lavan have an excuse to do what he wanted to do, and that is to destroy Jacob, because that's what he was intending. That's what the accuser of the brethren is all about. He brings these accusations against God's people day and night. But it seems to me, God not listening to the accuser of the brethren. He's not listening to him. I'll deal with my family, you keep your mouth shut. That's Bill's paraphrase. But that seems to be what he's saying here. Balak is seeing all these awful things about him, but he has Balaam tell him the God of Israel doesn't see any iniquity in Jacob. He is not seeing wickedness in Israel. The Lord is with him. The shout of a king is among them. Now, these are the same people I might want to remind you who have been grumbling and complaining the last 2 or 3 Torah portions to the point that God just got fed up with a lot of it. So we can't say that these were great and wonderful people, but it's not about that. It's about God's purpose for these imperfect people. Because Balaam is allowed to see a vision of what is to be, a vision of what the outcome is going to be, which speaks to the purpose. And so he has this vision. He begins to speak prophetically, and he sees a time in the future when God's people are going to be a united people under the kingship of the Messiah. The shout of a king is among them, he says. And then he says this, how lovely are your tents, O Jacob, your dwellings, O Israel, Ma Tovu, which is a reminder of how God sees his people, his children, his family in regard to their destiny and in regard to their purpose. And it's not to say that there aren't shortcomings and weaknesses among them, because we all know that there are, and we have to look no farther than this guy, okay? We all know that. He knows that. But it's not so much that he is looking on what we used to be, and maybe not so much on what we are right now, and that is not to say that he condones, endorses, or winks at our shortcomings and our bad choices and are stupid. It's just to say that I'll deal with it. I'm not going to let somebody who wants your destruction bring a curse against you just because you're here. He's not going to allow that. He's not going to allow it to prosper, I should put it that way. Because God's purpose is that God's people are to be good, to be tov. And we all remember what that means, right? You're where you're supposed to be. You're doing what you're supposed to do. When Rebekah's sons were born, it describes Jacob this way. Chapter 25, verse 27. Jacob was a mild man, dwelling in tents. The Hebrew term for mild, tam, which is the singular version of tamim, a phrase you guys are familiar with, a word you're familiar with. It means that he's whole, he's complete, he's lacking nothing. Now, was he a perfect guy at that point in time? No, he wasn't perfect, but he was the one God chose to perfect. And he's going to bring something forth from this man. Through all the trials, through all the situations, he's going to bring something from this man. He has a purpose for him. He has chosen him. So I won't say he's a perfect man, but he's a man who God has chosen to perfect, which would imply then that this is a man who's capable and demonstrated that he ruled his emotions rather than allowing his emotions to rule him. He's not without his frailties. He's not without fear. He's not without doubt and uncertainty. When he's going to meet Esau the night before, he says, God, I'm afraid. You said this, but I'm afraid. So he does have those kinds of things. He's capable of deception if his mom puts him up to it, right? But that's really not his nature. And so there are these imperfections, but the point is God sees something in him that is going to align with his purpose for him. And so he chooses to see Jacob, the tents of Jacob, not as necessarily a bunch of people grumbling and complaining all the time, but in future, in time, as they go through this process, there is going to be a united nation who are going to fulfill my purpose in the earth under the kingship of the Messiah. And so that's why we need to be looking beyond what's going on right now and what's going to happen tomorrow to look at what is coming in God's time, according to God's plan. To be able to look beyond the circumstances of our present situation, as enticing as it is to get drawn into. But we need to be able to look beyond that, to understand what is God saying to me through all of this mess. What does it mean for me and for my family, and how do we respond to the things that are going on in the world so that we can continue doing what God has called us to do? Jacob was a man who did not return evil with evil, but he walked in his integrity in spite of what everybody else was doing. So the idea that he's introduced to us as one who dwells in tents, as far as I'm concerned, that indicates community, unity, peace, shalom. Some people believe that it means that he was very studious. He was wanting to learn about God's word. Maybe both of them are correct, because that would make sense for us to come together and break bread. We're talking about the bread from heaven, to go into the word, to understand the word and how it applies to us as we do these things unified and in shalom in a community. Some people believe that indicates that Jacob was a shepherd. Well, maybe that's true as well, because God always chooses shepherds, right? He always chooses those people who have the heart of a shepherd. We see that, the fruition of that in the Messiah, who is the good shepherd. So I'm saying that all of these things can be true, and probably are, because they are indicative of what God is looking for in all of his people. And to come into the fruition of that purpose is why he looks on Jacob and says, I don't see any iniquity in him, even though he knows there are shortcomings. I see a people that I have called, that I have chosen, that I have set apart, that I have empowered by my word and by my spirit, who are going to go through difficulty, but in the end, I will finish what I started and bring them into the fruition of my purpose. So then, in God's eyes, Jacob's tent is considered tov. Does that mean we have arrived? It does not. And if you want to argue that point, I can share some things with you. But if he conceived, then I need to believe that he has a purpose in mind. And it goes for this congregation and that congregation and that congregation, because this is what he's calling the body to do. To be a voice in the wilderness, make the crooked paths straight, prepare the way of the Lord, to be a light in the midst of that darkness that is not hidden, but is out there for everybody to see, and particularly those who hate and despise what the light is, who want to extinguish the light. But we saw that God is well able to preserve somebody if he wants to. So what have we learned in this Torah portion? There have always been and there will always be people who despise those that God has blessed, and simply for that reason. Simply because they exist and God blesses them. And they will plot, they will scheme, they'll threaten. And why? It's because they're in dread of God's people. They're in dread of God's purpose. Now, the person may not acknowledge that, but the spirit that's driving them most certainly does. Matovu is a reminder to us of why it is absolutely critical that God's people learn to dwell together in unity. And as I've said many times before, not in uniformity. It's a difference. Uniform is what the world wants. Uniformity, that's what the world wants. The world wants bricks. They want to fashion the mold, and they want to take the clay and the straw and the mud, and they pour it into the mold that they have fashioned so that every brick is like the next one. But God creates stones and rocks, and he has the ability to take that stone that is different from that stone, that's different from that stone, and then somehow or another fit them together to build up this spiritual house in which he wants to reside. So, yes, give him thanks. So Matovu is a reminder to us just how critical it is that you and I learn to dwell together in unity. It's like the oil that was poured on Aaron and it ran down his beard and down to his garments. It's like Mount Hermon, which, is this high place, and then the river Jordan runs down, and it talks about life and all these kinds of things. That's what comes forth from that. Matovu is a reminder that even the heathen eventually will have to declare God's sovereignty. And I say that for this reason. Where do those words, Matovu, come from? Whose mouth uttered those words? Balaam. Balaam. So every Shabbat we get together and we sing this song that was basically composed by someone who hated Israel and wanted them dead. It's like God's way of saying, but we do it every week. It's a reminder that even the heathen has to declare God's sovereignty. And it's also a reminder that the adversary is incapable. He does not have the power to curse and destroy what God has blessed. But it is also a reminder that we need to make sure that we are walking upright before him and that we do not stray out from under his protective umbrella and go and collaborate and to, consort with the daughters of Midian and get into all that kind of crazy stuff. In other words, we need to be very careful not to fall into a trap, and the adversary is very good about traps. Very good about laying a trap. We need to be very careful of those things. And so then, I'll close with this. As things heat up, and I say that with this in mind, we're about to enter the straits. Right? And I don't know, some people don't think anything of that. I'm not going to be for or against. I'm just going to say it's really interesting that there are things that do happen at certain times of the year, in the biblical year, that make you go, wow, interesting. So we're about to enter that time. Well, it seems like things have already kind of heated up. I don't think we've seen the end of things just yet, okay? So as we enter into this season, let's don't fall into the enemy's trap. There are things and there will be things that are going to provoke us to lose focus, to get our eyes on other kinds of things. But through everything that's happening and we need to keep our focus on the Messiah. Thank you, Celso, for reminding us of that. Because you see, if we keep our eyes on him, he's going to lead us through all of these things. He'll lead us through the straits. He'll lead us through the difficulty. And he will lead us to the goal. He will bring us to that place where he sees the tents of Jacob as having no iniquity. I don't see any wickedness in them. And so then, if God has a purpose for you and for me, anyone, any of us that God has a purpose for, and the reality is, as Mary prayed, there's no one here or out there by accident. God breathed the breath of life into each and every one of us, and when he did, he created within each and every one of us the gifts, the talents, the skills, and the purpose for bringing us into this existence. And as long as we walk in that purpose, doing what we're supposed to do, being where we're supposed to be, we should not fear any weapon that is formed against us, because no weapon formed against us shall prosper. Amen? Let's thank the Father for that right now.